Okay, let's get into this. Imagine seeing a headline like "Space Program Grounded by Tweets." I mean, sounds wild, right?
Actually, sounds like clickbait.
But incredibly, that's pretty much what almost happened recently. You had this public spat between a former president and a major tech billionaire.
And it's somehow put a shadow over how the U.S. gets astronauts to space.
Exactly. It was this really unexpected drama reaching, I mean, literally up to the space station.
Yeah, the speed of it all was almost jarring. One minute you're reading about standard politics, the next it's, potentially affecting low Earth orbit.
Right. So in this deep dive, we're going to try and untangle that whole situation. We're looking at this recent political clash involving Elon Musk and Donald Trump.
And the really surprising bit, its immediate potential impact on SpaceX and, maybe most importantly, the American space program's reliance on the Dragon spacecraft. It's critical.
Absolutely critical. Now, to understand this, we've pulled together insights from quite a few places.
Yeah, we're looking at news reports, space.com, AP News, Futurism, Live Science, Politico, The Standard, places like that.
And we've also got info straight from NASA's Commercial Crew Program page, SpaceX's own mission details, too.
We even looked at a Reddit thread, just to get a feel for the real-time reactions as it all unfolded. Kind of captures the moment.
So our mission today is really to walk you through this pretty volatile episode. We need to explain why Dragon is so essential right now.
And then see what this whole public disagreement tells us about the state of U.S. space capabilities.
Especially, the vulnerabilities that might come with relying so heavily on these big public-private partnerships.
It's a fascinating case study, really. Earthly arguments reaching for the stars, so to speak.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. The flashpoint. According to the sources, it all kicked off with this public disagreement, mostly on social media.
Right. It started when Elon Musk voiced some pretty strong criticism about a proposed tax and spending bill.
He reportedly went on X, his platform, and called it a disgusting abomination. Pretty strong words.
Very strong. And that drew a very direct, very public response from President Donald Trump.
Yeah, multiple reports covered his statement on his own social media platform. He talked about saving money in the budget.
He suggested a way to save billions and billions of dollars, as he put it.
And that way was,
quote, terminate Elon's governmental subsidies and contracts. He framed it specifically as saving taxpayer money.
And he even seemed surprised, based on the quotes, that the previous administration hadn't done it already.
Exactly. That was the context.
And Musk's first reaction was fast. And frankly, if you follow the space industry, pretty alarming.
Yeah, reacting to Trump's mention of canceling contracts, Musk tweeted that SpaceX will begin decommissioning its Dragon spacecraft immediately.
Just think about that for a second. Decommissioning Dragon, that's the only operational U.S. vehicle flying astronauts right now.
It was definitely a high-stakes move, a strategic response, you could say.
And it immediately caused waves, right? In the space community, D.C., everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. Because it targeted something fundamental to how the U.S. operates in space currently.
You said critical earlier, and that almost feels like putting it mildly, doesn't it? How vital is Dragon, based on what the sources say?
Well, yeah, indispensable is a word that popped up a lot. Sources called it not just critical, but the de facto method.
The main way.
Pretty much the only way, for NASA astronauts to get to the International Space Station. And increasingly for private astronauts, too.
And this capability, it's fairly new in the grand scheme of things. SpaceX only started flying crews under NASA's Commercial Crew Program back in, 2020?
That's right. Demo 2 in 2020 was the first one. And that program itself is the key context here.
Okay, tell us about that.
Well, after the space shuttle retired, NASA had a problem. They needed a way to get astronauts to the ISS from U.S. soil again.
Right.
So the Commercial Crew Program was set up to partner with private American companies to develop spacecraft that were safe, reliable, and importantly, cost-effective.
And Dragon is basically the star pupil of that program.
Exactly. It's the main success story so far.
And when you look at the spacecraft itself, I mean, the details from SpaceX and the mission reports, it was really designed for this job from the start, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It wasn't like, a cargo ship they modified heavily. It was purpose-built for people.
Capable of carrying up to 7, though usually it's 4 for crew rotations or those Axiom private missions we've seen.
Right. 4 crew plus some sensitive cargo. And let's not forget the cargo-only version of Dragon, still totally essential for station resupply.
Okay, but the historical context really drives home why having Dragon is so important now.
It really does. When the space shuttle program ended back in 2011, The U.S. literally had no way to launch its own astronauts. Zero.
So for almost 10 years.
Yep, from 2011 until Dragon flew in 2020, the only way for American astronauts to reach the ISS was on Russian Soyuz rockets.
And that wasn't cheap, was it? I remember seeing figures.
Not at all. Reports back then consistently mentioned NASA paying Russia, upwards of $80 million per seat.
Wow. Per astronaut.
Per astronaut per flight. So you can imagine when SpaceX finally got Dragon certified and flew Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley on Demo 2.
That was a huge deal.
Monumental for NASA, for the U.S. space program. It ended that reliance on Russia, brought launches back to American soil.
And it was seen as a big win for that whole public-private partnership idea NASA was pushing.
Definitely. It was held up as proof that the model could work, delivering capability faster and maybe cheaper.
Now, Dragon wasn't the only horse in that race, though. NASA also contracted with Boeing for Starliner.
That's true. But the sources paint a very, very different picture of Starliner's status.
How so?
Well, words like much maligned, significant issues come up constantly in reports.
Right, I remember hearing about software glitches on the first test flight, valve problems.
Yeah, all sorts of things. Software timing errors, sticky valves, parachute testing issues. There was even that one uncrewed test flight where they discovered issues that meant if astronauts had been on board, they likely would have had to return on a Dragon anyway.
Oof. And where does Starliner stand right now?
It's currently grounded. Boeing's working through the latest set of issues found after its first crewed test flight, which itself faced problems in orbit.
So realistically, it's still a ways off from being a regular taxi service.
That's what all the reporting suggests.
Yeah.
Likely still years away from being fully certified and operational for routine crew rotations. So while it's there as a potential future option.
Today, Dragon is it. The only game in town for U.S. crew flights.
Pretty much, yeah. The single certified operational U.S. ride to the ISS.
Which brings us right back to that moment, that threat from Musk. If he had actually followed through, decommissioned Dragon, what happens then?
Well, the most immediate thing, the most visible, is the U.S. loses that independent way to get crew to the ISS instantly.
So we'd be back to square one, like after the shuttle retired.
Essentially, yes. Or worse, potentially. We'd be looking at relying on international partners again, assuming that's even feasible quickly, or possibly having no way to get U.S. astronauts up or down for a while.
And this dependence on SpaceX, it's not just about getting people to the ISS, is it? The sources made that pretty clear.
Oh, not even close. It's much broader. NASA uses SpaceX rockets, the Falcon 9 mainly, for tons of stuff.
Booklet.
Science missions, probes heading out into the solar system, Earth observation satellites, plus critical launches for the U.S. Space Force. Military payloads.
And future stuff, too. I remember Artemis.
Huge part of the future plans. NASA picked SpaceX's Starship as the lander to take astronauts back to the moon's surface for the Artemis program.
That's a massive contract, right?
Billions. Sources mentioned around $4 billion invested by NASA just in that Starship landing system contract. And SpaceX even has the contract to help safely deorbit the ISS at the end of its life in 2030.
So messing with SpaceX contracts isn't just about the ISS. It touches basically every major area of U.S. space activity.
Exactly. Science, national security, future exploration like the moon landings, it's all deeply interconnected with SpaceX's launch capabilities now.
So cutting off SpaceX or even just seriously disrupting them?
It could really hobble U.S. space activities across the board for years, potentially. Some commentators, framed it starkly.
How so?
Suggesting it could be seen as like surrendering ground to competitors like China and Russia, especially since the commercial crew program has been seen as such a success in restoring U.S. launch capability.
And the money involved. One source put a number on it, didn't they? The value of the contracts potentially at risk.
Yeah, one estimate was around $22 billion. Possibly higher, even. That's the scale of existing government business SpaceX has.
$22 billion. Wow.
And there was debate, could SpaceX even keep Dragon flying without those government contracts?
Could they? Just on commercial flights, like Axiom.
Some argued probably not. I mean, the overhead, the development costs for Dragon, for Starship, it's immense. The big government contracts, NASA, Space Force, they're seen as foundational. They help sustain these critical capabilities.
So this wasn't just, Twitter drama. Real multi-billion-dollar consequences were suddenly on the table.
Absolutely. Very real stakes.
But then it just stopped as fast as it started.
It de-escalated incredibly quickly, yeah. Just a few hours after that initial tweet about decommissioning Dragon, Musk walked it back.
How did he do that?
Just as publicly. Reportedly, in a reply on X, he just said something simple like, okay, we want decommissioned Dragon.
That's it.
That was basically it. The immediate crisis averted.
The speed is just striking. Some of the commentary you mentioned earlier really captured that.
Yeah, people watching it unfold felt like things were moving incredibly fast. Like that quote, an hour is about a century right now.
Captures the feeling of whiplash, I guess.
And another describing it as, well, using more colorful language about things being flung so fast. It was just a really volatile, intense moment that flared up and then seemed to dissipate, at least for now, in just an afternoon.
It really gives you a sense of how fast things can change, doesn't it? When you have these huge figures, huge companies, and critical national assets all mixed up in a public argument.
Mm-hmm. And that really leads us to the bigger picture, What does this whole short, sharp shock actually reveal about the U.S. space program right now?
What's the main takeaway for you looking at the sources on that bigger picture?
I think it fundamentally underscores just how much the U.S. now relies on private partners, especially SpaceX, for things that used to be purely government domain.
Like just getting to orbit.
Getting to orbit, crew transport, future moon landings, national security launches. It's a huge shift.
And this incident showed how political fights, even if they seem like, just posturing or a war of words, as some sources put it,
yeah, even if it's just temporary friction between powerful people, it can instantly create real uncertainty for vital programs. Programs built entirely on these partnerships working smoothly.
Was there any serious talk about, the government taking over SpaceX assets if things got worse?
It was mentioned in some discussions, the idea of nationalization.
Mm-hmm.
But the sources and experts were quick to point out that's incredibly complicated.
Not something you can just do overnight.
Definitely not. It's not like a president can just tweet it into existence.
Yeah.
It would involve huge legal hurdles, likely need Congress, face court challenges.
Yeah.
It's a massive, difficult process, not a quick fix. So it was more of a hypothetical what if than a realistic immediate threat.
Okay, so the takeaway is this public-private model, it's delivered. It got the U.S. launching crews again, maybe more cost-effectively in some ways.
For sure. It has clear benefits.
But this incident kind of shines a spotlight on the other side of the coin, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows that the stability of these critical national capabilities can now be affected by, personal relationships, political spats, things happening between the partners.
And it all plays out very publicly, potentially creating instability, or at least the perception of it.
Exactly. The resilience of the system is now partly tied to the dynamics between government and these very powerful private entities and individuals. It puts the vulnerabilities right out there.
So let's wrap this up. Thinking about everything we've just discussed, this brief but really dramatic flare-up, what does it truly suggest about where space exploration is heading? A future that seems more and more reliant on these big private companies, big personalities.
Well, I think it forces us to ask a really fundamental question, doesn't it? If you care about space exploration, how do national programs ensure things remain stable and resilient?
When a Twitter feud can potentially ground your astronauts.
Right. How do you manage that risk? Especially when your plans stretch from low Earth orbit all the way back to the moon, and they depend so heavily on these partnerships.
It's definitely something to think about. How do you build in that resilience when politics and personalities can inject so much volatility seemingly out of nowhere?
That's the challenge, I think, for the U.S. and for any other nation going down this public-private path in space. It's a question they'll need to keep asking.